Okay, and we are going live in just a moment on Facebook. Thanks to all of you who are joining us on Zoom.
Yes, hello everyone. Hello Ari and Catherine. Hello David. Hello Henry, Layla, Michael, Miles. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, it is now officially 2 p.m. and so I will kick off our program officially by saying good afternoon and Shavua Tov and welcome. And I hope the start of this new week is finding you all safe and well in the places where you are and with the people who are with you in this time. So welcome to an afternoon online, an hour online together that is the online version this year of our annual Reisman Forum, made possible for Harvard Hillel by the late Mandel Bill Berman in memory of Robert Reisman, both of blessed memory. I'm Jonah Steinberg. I'm the executive director here at Harvard Hillel and a member of our multi-denominational rabbinic and program team and a Harvard chaplain. And I am so glad that my role here today, beyond welcoming you and thanking our three special guests in Israel for being with us or letting us be with them, is to welcome back to Harvard Hillel our friend and colleague, Lauren Cohen Fisher. One of our students will say a bit more about Lauren in a moment, but I just want to say that Lauren is filling in here today for our new IACT Israel Programs Director, Michael Reuven, who is newly out on paternity leave and just had a beautiful baby naming online today for his and Naomi's new son, Ezra. For my part, let me share with you that in her time here, Lauren was not only a thought partner to me, but a frontline creator of Harvard Hillel's approach to Israel programming. And let me say about that approach that it is about encountering Israel fully and circumspectly in a context of commitment. And the intelligence and the effectiveness and the great good spirit in that approach are very much due to what Lauren did and helped us build while she was here. And we continue to build upon that now with Michael. A lot of people out there seem to fear that if we enable our students to grapple firsthand with the fullness of Israel, its challenges as well as its joys and delights, they will turn tail and run away. We find that exactly the opposite is true. By creating our unique Trek-Stension program, in which our students spend 5 more days in Israel after a birthright itinerary to go deeper into issues of Israeli society and geopolitics with members of parliament and Supreme Court justices and negotiators and journalists. Lauren and Harvard Hillel in Lauren's time here more than tripled the size of our Israel trips, and the effect of that in raising the discourse on Israel on our campus has been tremendous. And that is the spirit in which we offer today's program, a spirit of encountering Israel as closely as we can and as intimately and in a context of commitment and of caring with our Israeli sisters and brothers in this time. So on that note, let me introduce the two students who are here with us, with Lauren and with our guests, to help lead the conversation today. Alyssa Klee is a Harvard College student in the class of 2022 who normally lives in Elliott House, but is in New York currently. She's concentrating in molecular and cellular biology with a citation in Spanish and wants to be an oncologist. Alyssa researches cancer immunotherapy at the Freeman Lab at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and also volunteers in her free time at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. She is involved with several organizations on our campus, including the Harvard College Undergraduate Research Association, Harvard's Women Club Volleyball, Harvard Model Congress, the Harvard Israel Program Fellowship, and Harvard Israel Initiative. Michael Jasper is a Harvard College student in the class of 2021, concentrating in social studies. His coursework focuses primarily on the Middle East and North Africa, but also includes study of China and Taiwan, where he studied Chinese. In addition, he has worked as a research assistant and student fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, focusing on issues of disinformation. He's previously worked as both a software engineering intern and a product management intern at Google. And Michael's thesis focuses on the role of social service organizations in the acculturation of Yotzim B'She'elah, that is, those who choose to exit ultra-Orthodox communities, particularly in Jerusalem, in the case of Michael's study. And before turning the program over to Michael and Alyssa and Lauren, along with Maayan and Amos and Nathan, let me just remind you all that the next open online event of this kind from Harvard Hillel will be this Tuesday evening with Harvard's Provost Alan Garber. You'll receive an email about that after today's program if you haven't already. And I can share the exciting word as well that on the evening of May 18th, we will host Harvard's president, Larry Bacow. So stay tuned for that and for other programs between now and then. So over to Michael and Alyssa with Lauren and Maayan and Nathan and Amos, and thank you all for being here.
So I will first introduce Lauren Cohen Fisher and Jaffe-Hoffman. So Lauren Cohen Fisher is the Associate Director of Israel Education for Hillel International and former Director of Israel Education at Harvard Hillel. An educator at heart and in practice, Lauren teaches about the Israeli landscape for both national and local audiences. Lauren currently runs Masterclass Israel, a 5-month fellowship training Hillel campus professionals to become Israel educators. In her previous role as the Director of Israel Education at Harvard Hillel, Lauren pioneered Trextension, a 5-day geopolitical add-on to the Harvard Birthright Trip. Lauren received her BA in Government from Colby College and her MA in Political Science from Tel Aviv University. A summer camp counselor at heart, Lauren's favorite pastime is finding the right icebreaker for the moment and meaningfully gathering people. Maayan Hoffman is a news editor and head of online content and strategy for the Jerusalem Post. She is the former Vice President of Marketing and Brand Strategy for Israel 365, an editorial director for Breaking Israel News, and the former Director of International Communications for the Israel Democracy Institute. An American-Israeli journalist since 1995, Maayan served as the editor-in-chief of the Baltimore Jewish Times and managing editor of the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle. Her work has appeared in American Spectator, Fox, The Hill, and Roll Call, among other places.
And now I'm going to start with introducing Amos Haarel. Amos Haarel has been the military correspondent and defense analyst for Haaretz for the last 12 years. In this role, he has written extensively about Israel's ongoing fight against terrorist organizations, its battles during the Palestinian Intifada, which is an uprising, and the last war in Lebanon. Prior to his current position, Haarel spent 4 years as a night editor for Haaretz Hebrew print edition, and from 1999 to 2005 was the anchorman on a weekly army radio program about defense issues. He also frequently appears in the Israeli and foreign media as a military pundit. Sorry if I butchered that. Along with Avi Issacharoff, Haarel co-wrote The Seventh War, How We Won and Why We Lost the War with the Palestinians, a 2004 book about the Second Intifada. The book, and a bestseller in Israel, has been translated into French and Arabic and won the prestigious Chechik Award in 2005 for outstanding security research. Next, I will be introducing Nathan Jeffay. For his readers on different continents, journalist Nathan Jeffay is a key source of information and analysis on what is happening in Israel. Jeffay has been a journalist for 20 years and has been covering Israel since 2007. He is a coronavirus specialist for the Times of Israel, contributing editor and with the Jewish Week of New York, associate Israel correspondent with the Jewish Chronicle of London, and Jerusalem correspondent with The Tablet, an international Christian weekly. He lectures widely on the topics he covers.
Thank you so much, Jonah and Michael and Alyssa, for your wonderful, beautiful introductions. Again, my name is Lauren Cohen Fisher. I'm so excited to be moderating this panel today. Thank you, Amos, Maayan, and Nathan for coming together. Thank you so much, Harvard Hillel, for putting this together. And Jonah, you mentioned a shout out to Michael, and I want to give him one more. Michael, who normally would be standing here in my place, has a wonderful Simcha celebration that he is taking part in today. He has welcomed a new member into his family and is not joining us, but he put in so much effort to make sure that this program happened. So to all those who are watching who know Michael, please be sure to give him a mazal tov, both on putting together this wonderful group of people and to the addition to his family. What we'll be doing for the next roughly 1 hour together is exploring through the eyes of three fabulous journalists what Israeli society looks like, both beyond and underneath the headlines of coronavirus. Our goal tonight, as we gather, is to try and identify what is surfacing in Israeli society and what might be slipping through the cracks. What are things that we can understand as we look back to the last 3 months in Israeli society, and how might these three guests that we have here tonight be able to share their wisdom of journalism with us in helping to understand those questions. So I'm going to begin. We'll go through a few questions from me. We will turn it over to questions from students and from the audience. And after that, we'll let our speakers give a few closing words together. And to kick us off, I would love if we could hear from all three of you. We'll start first with Amos, then Maayan, then Nathan. From where you're sitting, what are some of the big picture takeaways that you would identify from the last few months in Israel?
Okay, good evening from Israel. Thank you for inviting me. Let's do a top four within a minute or so. I'd make the four important points right now. One is that Israel's case is different than most Western countries. We're somewhat luckier. We're facing an unprecedented phenomena, at least in our lifetime, just like everybody else. But the fact that Israel is somewhat isolated, one entrance gate to the country through Ben Gurion Airport, and that Israel was lucky enough to take the right decisions at the right moment in the beginning of the crisis, means that we're doing okay. There are 16,000 Israelis who were ill with the virus. More than half of them have recovered already. 230 deaths. But all things considered, when you compare that to the situation in other Western countries, we're doing okay. Which leads me to the second issue, our medical system. I think more than anything else, the fact that our doctors and nurses, our professionals, helps us challenge this and help us through this crisis, which is of course scary and frightening, and we haven't seen the end of it yet, that there are economic consequences for everybody. But then again, and I have quite a lot of criticism about certain government decisions and so on, but then again, I think that Israel has been doing better than most countries, and more than anything else, this is thanks to our professionals. The third point I should make has to do with the Israeli society. I think in the end, you're familiar with our President Reuven Rivlin's quote about the 4 different tribes of the Israeli society. We've known that for years. We've seen political crisis and so on. But in the end, what we see now, I think, is more solidarity than any time before in recent Israeli history. More than anything else, especially between Jews and Arab Israelis. The fact that Arab Israelis are part of the fight, if you'd like, mostly as being part of the medical teams and so on, I think in the long run, it may help improve the relationship between inside our society. And the fourth point I should make, would probably talk more about that later, is that we're facing a terrible political crisis. As we speak, there were, I think, about 10-hour deliberations today at the Supreme Court. You're familiar with the political situation and so on, but we're facing something that we haven't seen before. A prime minister who's fighting for his political life, but also facing enormous legal problems. And a lot of Israelis are seeing this as maybe as the most significant and the most serious part of the crisis the country is going through.
Amazing. And Amos, you mentioned as you were speaking the 4 tribes. For anyone who's tuning in who is not familiar with President Rivlin's speech, will you just quickly make a nod to what you were referring to there?
It's the secular Jewish camp, the Arab Israeli, the Zionist religious, and the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim. I think these are the 4 tribes he was speaking of.
Yeah. Thank you. Maayan, I'm curious, are you feeling similar takeaways or do you see things differently from where you sit? Oh, I'm going to unmute you. There you go.
Okay, great. So some similar and some different. I mean, I think the first one that Amos alluded to, which is that some of what we generally see as Israel's as Israel challenges are actually proving to be benefits in the fight against corona. So the one entrance that we mentioned that people can only get in through Ben Gurion, our borders are closed. Unlike in European countries, the prime minister liked to compare us to Italy, for example, or they like to compare us to Belgium or Switzerland, who have similar populations. But in reality, we're very, very different in that our borders are locked, and there you can drive through the borders. There's a lot less control, and that helps us in the fight against corona. At the same time, our small size of only 9 million citizens is very helpful when it comes to being able to roll out restrictions and helping to get people to adhere to them to contain population. So that's been a real benefit to us, whereas normally we look at that as a challenge. I would say that in contrast to what Amos said, while we have fabulous medical professionals, our medical system has actually proved to be a huge detriment. One of the reasons that we know that we had to very, very quickly lock down the entire country proactively and almost hysterically, in some ways, again, saving us in terms of the number of people who died, ensuring that we didn't have too many people taking up the ventilators that we might not have had. At the same time, we did that because we knew that our medical system was broken, our hospitals were already overcrowded, and there was a real challenge even in terms of the number of medical professionals that we have here to treat serious patients. And I think that this coronavirus crisis has really highlighted that and hopefully lit a fire underneath our soon-to-be next health minister, whoever that will be, to recognize that we need to infuse more funds into ensuring that the health system is stable in Israel for whether it's a next round of coronavirus or any other pandemic or general illness that we have here in the country. A third takeaway would be, I would say, even outside of the amazing solidarity that we saw between the Arab-Israeli community following the Hanchayot, following the restrictions, and really being a part of in the hospitals themselves, we've also seen tremendous collaboration despite the media rhetoric that goes on between the Palestinians living in, the West Bank, and even somewhat in terms of what we let into Gaza happened from here. At different points, the United Nations has complemented our collaboration. And I think that's significant, especially in a time when we have threats of annexation and all kinds of challenges going on in the political sphere. The fact that when it came to coronavirus, we were able to put those differences aside and to help one another was a beautiful takeaway. And I think the fourth thing is trust. In order to get through a coronavirus pandemic or through any pandemic, you need trust in your government. And in all polls that we do, whether from the Israel Democracy Institute or otherwise, we put out these polls every year, surveys that look at how do Israelis feel about their government. And the political parties, the Knesset, the government always ranks very low. We tend to not have trust in our government. But what we saw here was when push came to shove, and the prime minister delivered his messages and the health ministry delivered its messages. What we saw is that people did trust and they followed. And the surveys that came out throughout this last 2 months, they were doing weekly surveys here in the country, looking at how Israelis felt about the decisions that were being made by the government. And the vast majority, generally between both Arab Israeli community and Jewish community, found that there was more than 50, sometimes 60 and 70% trust in the messages being delivered by the government and the health ministry. And I think that really says something about Israeli society. We're a country that knows how to handle war. We saw this as a war against the virus, and when people needed to, they listened. And I think that was really special to see as well.
Thank you. Nathan.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of very interesting points made already. I'll give 4 brief points, which I think the first actually connects up with something that Maayan was saying, which is about preparation for emergencies. We have a population that is just kind of generally very prepared, but in terms of kind of the readiness of society, I was speaking to family in England who were unable to get basic supplies. Over here, there was about, half a day of panic buying, and the supplies in the shops have been very complete. There hasn't been panic buying. People have been very calm. Everything has remained well stocked, and that comes from part of Israel's culture of always being ready. I think another aspect here is the innovation culture, that the response straight away, even before the lockdown, we saw Israel's startup nation attitude, with people straight away starting to come up with various solutions in all sorts of areas to try to help through this crisis. And I've interviewed all sorts of people coming up with DIY ventilators, people coming up with solutions to help medical teams, all sorts of. It's kind of really been a nationwide brain trust of all people trying to come up with all sorts of ideas to move this forward. And many of those ideas are percolating outside of Israel, which is a great thing and a very exciting thing for Israelis. So that innovation culture, I'm sure we'll come back to that. Picking up on the theme of Arabs and Jewish people here in Israel, I think one interesting observation which was made to me was that in many previous national emergencies, we've had a situation where, because a large percentage of the Arab population does not serve in the military, there has been a sense that it's been the Jewish people on the front lines in a situation of war, for example. And there's been a feeling that Arabs have, to a large extent, not been full participants in that national emergency. Here we actually have the tables turned. There's a disproportionate percentage of doctors and nurses who are drawn from Arab populations. And I don't think we've ever had a time in Israel when so many Jewish lives have quite literally been in Arab hands. And I think that really is leading to a change in mindset. I was interviewing some people last week who made a video about this. That video has been viewed by, I think, close to 2 million Israelis by now. So that's something really remarkable that is happening. And the last observation which I'd make for now is that as someone who's been living in Israel for about 10 years, I think when I arrive, we all have that perception of, if you stand in a line and wait in a line in Israel, you will see all sorts of people cutting in the line, and people like to do things their own way. And, people say this is a nation of 9 million prime ministers who know how to do everything in the best way possible. But when it came down to this moment of national emergency, people did, I think, in a way that surprised people, actually follow the directions. And I think part of that comes from the military experience, that a large percentage of the population has served in the military. I think it also comes from the fact that we have 2 cultures here, 3 cultures here, Jewish, Muslim, also an important Christian minority as well, who come from cultures where there's this very ingrained high value of life. And I think that's made a large difference and actually pushed people who like to usually think for themselves to actually follow directions very closely.
Wow, there's so much there in what you just said, and I'd love to unpack all of it. Before we do that, Maayan, you mentioned the word trust when you were speaking, and one of the things that I had been thinking about as we were coming into this event here is that in the last few years, journalism and media has been under such scrutiny, and there's been such a lack of trust between people and between media. And I'm curious, from where you're sitting, does it feel like that has shifted? Does it feel like there is more trust in the media? As someone who also is sitting just in a small apartment and only maybe talks to 1 or 2 neighbors, I feel like all of a sudden journalists have become my purveyors of ultimate truth. I don't even know what's happening in the world without them. So I'm curious, if you mentioned trust in terms of government, but I'm wondering how it plays out in terms of media as well.
Sure, that's a great question. I actually wrote down some statistics on that because it's pretty striking. So normally media falls right there, about 36% in 2000. The last Israel Democracy Institute's study showed any trust in the media. That was among the lowest. There was political parties, Knesset, and then the media were the 3 bottom rungs. And what's interesting is that actually here we saw a shift that whereas social networks, people did not trust, of course, what they saw on social networks, and that's a good thing. But there was it was more than a 50% trust. Even many of them, more than 10% really trusted, very much felt trust in what they were reading in the media. That's very strong in Israel, and it was actually stronger among the Arab Israeli population over the Jewish Israeli, which is also striking. And so I think that what has happened is that, yes, I sit in a couple of hats here at the Jerusalem Post, and as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm the head of online content and the news editor, as much as I am also our sort of health reporter water. And what has happened even on our own website is I have seen a tremendous amount of growth. We had 150% growth month on month, year on year in terms of web traffic. And that was not just the Jerusalem Post, that's across the web, internationally and nationally, in terms of people were on lockdown, people are sitting, as you said, in their homes, and they're reading the news, and they had to find the places that they trusted. And what we saw is that there was a huge responsibility. First of all, it's a really big weight, like knowing that that many people are reading. There's certain articles that millions and millions of people actually read, and then you have to say to yourself, wow, did I get everything right? And I hope that I did a service. But I think that that it really, it's the media in general has taken on a very large role in this coronavirus crisis by nature of the fact that people are not around talking to each other. They're focused on what they can find and read online to answer their questions.
Amos and Nathan, would you agree? What are you noticing in terms of the relationship between the populace, trust, and the media?
It depends. When it comes to politics, we're still divided. And at the center of this, of course, is the prime minister, just like in a different way what's happening in America regarding the president. But the people of Israel are divided regarding their positions over Netanyahu, their attitudes towards Netanyahu. And if you tend to trust Netanyahu, then you distrust the media when it comes to the media reports on the prime minister. When it comes to the crisis, yes, I think most people come to the websites, and even print journalism, even print media still exists here because people want the information and they need it now. And I think there's a higher level of trust. Getting back to what Maayan discussed earlier, I agree that there's a rather high level of trust towards the government, at least until now. But what we're seeing during the last 2 weeks is that because the government mishandled the exit strategy, and because there are every day we hear reports of late night meetings in which are unable to reach decisions, and then they change their minds at the last moment and so on. What you see happening during the last few days is that some of this public trust has been eroded because of all those changes in government positions over the instructions to the public. And I think in the long run, this may become a problem, especially the discussion over the terms of lifting the lockdown right now.
Can you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean when you say it might become a problem?
Already, what you see during the last 2 weeks or so, that we had about 5 or 6 weeks of lockdown, which was almost complete, including Seder night, in which the government asked us not to go to our grandparents and told us that if children who were students at universities and did not live at home were forbidden to come home to Seder night, and so on. And this is something that most of the Jewish public in Israel accepted. These were the instructions. We felt that it was very, very dangerous, and we accepted that. On the other hand, later on, we found out that both the prime minister and the president avoided those same instructions and did what they wanted, including having family members who do not live with them currently at their homes. So this is a very good example. And what you see in the last 2 weeks or so is that the government has been discussing all kinds of changes to the instructions and gradually lifting the lockdown, while the public is already outside. Not everybody's working, but a lot more people are out on the streets, gradually arriving at the parks as well, gradually arriving at the beach. And the government is actually playing catch up with what the public is already doing, which is both of my colleagues mentioned the fact that Israelis were actually quite surprisingly obeying orders or instructions for quite some time and being responsible over that, perhaps more responsible than other nations. But right now, what you see is the other side of the Israeli national character, which is, I do what I think is necessary. Nobody tells me what to do. Everything we're familiar with from the past.
So I wanted to add that that in the Israeli psyche, I think there's something that goes very deep, which is when we are all in the same boat and we are all subject to the same harsh restrictions, however hard that is, then people feel that they can take it. But there is nothing that Israelis hate more than being what we call here a friar, feeling like the sucker. That's when you're at home and you don't have any of your friends around, and in the apartment next to you, they've got 3 families round. Or when you're being careful and having stayed a night without anybody, and then you hear that the Prime Minister had his son or the President had their daughter. And I think that's when things do start to fragment. And what we are seeing now is that, okay, that most intense phase is over. Now we're moving out of things, and it's not that a policy has been brought and this is the policy and we're sticking to the policy. What's come in is lots of different lobbies with lots of different agendas, and whose agenda should be listened to first and should be listened to the most. And that's where I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Amos, but I think maybe that's where some of the frictions come in and things do start to fragment. So I'll give you one example. In about 10 days' time, it's going to be Lag BaOmer, which is a very minor festival, but has taken on great significance to some Orthodox and particularly some ultra-Orthodox. Now, you would expect that in such times, the large gatherings would not be allowed. However, on Mount Meron in the Galilee, there are going to be 3 bonfires. Theoretically, each of them will have 100 people, but there will be 3 bonfires for this religious celebration. On the other hand, pride celebrations, LGBTQ pride celebrations in Tel Aviv will be delayed. Now you see how the frictions and the sectoral divides and the different agendas and the different lobbies come into play as we exit from this. So I think that's kind of a bit of the dynamic that's going on now.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that goes along with that is also, we talked about Israel being able to quickly do an about face and become prepared like in a time of war. But as we also said, we weren't really prepared, right? Our medical system is broken. We the comptroller report that went out showed that we weren't prepared for a pandemic. There'll be more coming out tomorrow afternoon talking about how we have issues with our hospital beds and otherwise. And now we've had about 8 weeks to prepare for an exit strategy, knowing that at some point we would get coronavirus under control. But similar to what Nathan, or related to what Nathan is saying, we not only didn't do that, we also, because we didn't do it, are now at a place where we're dealing with internal or infighting between the different parties. Even when you think about we did a great job locking down the country, but there were some things we didn't do a great job with. And one of those things, for example, was letting people who traveled from the United States into the country for diplomatic reasons. America, as we all know, and I mean, it's no secret, has a very high level of coronavirus, specifically New York, originally among the Orthodox population in New York, which was of course flying to Israel. And it took us too long to shut the borders there and to put people in quarantine. And there was a flip-flop policy, right, that happened then for diplomatic reasons is what many people understand. There was another issue, davening, praying with the minyan. It took way too long for us to stop people praying together. There was fights over why can this person walk their dog and I can't pray with the minyan? But the reality is that there's a very big difference. The dog needs to go outside and walk. When you're by yourself walking your dog, it's a less of a health risk than praying together as a group. But nonetheless, because of Litzman and his position, lobbied very strongly against it, and it took us a very long time. And now we're sort of seeing that happen with the exit strategy, but it's even worse because it's lack of transparency. We don't understand where the decisions are being made. And because there's a lack of communication, that is where I think Israelis are getting frustrated now. It's not only, okay, the prime minister had his son, and I agree with that, or the president had his daughter, also a problem, but people were still sort of maintaining, even after Passover, we went through Yom Ha'atzmaut, they gave out a lot of tickets, 1,000 fines, whatever it was, but it wasn't crazy on Yom Ha'atzmaut. But here we come now about a week later, and we're supposed to have this exit strategy, and they let some kids, one of my kids went back to school today, but she went from 10 to 1. I'm not really sure how that helps the parents who's supposed to be going to work. There's no indication of when the older kids are really going back, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month. No one's clear why the yeshivas went back at older ages, but also all the research shows kids under 10, yet kids only up to the age of 7 went back. So there's a lot of questions going on in terms of how are these decisions being made? Why are they being made? Who's making the decision? And, and also we have from the beginning, we understand, and this is an international understanding, that there's about a 2-week period, right, from when you get infected until when we see the results. So if we allow restrictions to be lifted, there should be a trajectory of monitoring and testing before we then lift additional restrictions. But it seems to be that based on interest, as Nathan referred, people can say, oh, but I really want to allow theaters to open, but these malls are suffering. Let's think of opening them next week. And we really need to be following that. We understand for health reasons. And when we don't do that, then it brings up a lot of questions. And I think, Amos put it very well. Then the Israeli attitude of, well, I know better. If they, they'll let the government follow me. The numbers are down. I'm going to go ahead and go out to the beach or whatever I'm going to do because I'm frustrated because I'm not communicated to directly. And Israelis want answers, and we're not getting them the way that we should be in a transparent and effective way.
Mm. It seems like what all three of you are alluding to is that as we are coming out of crisis, it's much easier to shut things down and lock things down than it is to open them up, because what starts to surface is all of these questions of politics. And something, Amos, in particular, I noticed you've woven into many of your articles that you've written on coronavirus is what some of the political implications are, how politics is never really absent from the conversation. And so I'm curious, this will be my last question, then I'll turn it over to the students. So if there's anyone out there in the audience who has a question, feel free to use the Q&A button in the bottom, and we will soon transition into Q&As from the audience. This will be one of my last. I'm curious, what is slipping through the cracks that would have otherwise been reported in the country that because of coronavirus has been on the back burner? There's so much going on right now in the government with Bibi and the coalition, with the unity government. There's the land, like what is slipping through the cracks, and what should we know about that we're currently not reading about?
Okay, perhaps very briefly, one point regarding the coronavirus still. One issue we should mention is the fact that I think about more than half of the Israelis who fell ill with the virus are actually from ultra-Orthodox communities. Now, this means that in places like Bnei Brak, and quite a large ultra-Orthodox town with around 200,000 people living close to Tel Aviv, there are thousands of cases, and I think more than 20 deaths. On the other hand, in Tel Aviv itself, you have about 1 or 2 new cases a day, and Tel Aviv is quite a big city. So in the end, what you have are secular people living in Tel Aviv who haven't met even one single person who had caught the virus until now. So their reality is very, very different from the reality in some of those ultra-Orthodox communities. So again, there's an issue of this is not my problem. This is not a direct threat to me. And I think this is rather different than what's happening in other countries. There are towns or places which are at the center of this and are suffering quite heavily. And there are places where there are hardly cases, where I live, for instance, and so on. The second point I should make, again, very, very briefly, the discussions regarding the new national unity government, Netanyahu has made a point of moving forward with annexation of parts of the West Bank, and he's claiming that the Trump administration would give him the green light for this. This is not the #1 issue in Israel right now. Ask most Israelis, they don't care about this right now. They want to go back to work. They're worried about unemployment. They're worried about their health and so on. They're not really concerned about that, but this may become a major problem come summer, considering our assessments that the virus would not disappear completely, but would not be such a huge health problem the way it is right now.
Mm-hmm. Maayan, I see you nodding. Do you agree? Do you have a different take?
No, I agree with the annexation issue. I think it's going to become one of our biggest issues as we move forward. And things that haven't appeared in the headlines are things exactly like that. Part of the unity agreement was this annexation. Of course, it's been reported on in Israel, but it's certainly not the most read article. They're not the most read articles on the website or in the newspaper. And that's because people are focused on coronavirus. But people, if it was not coronavirus, would be paying a lot of attention to this issue because part of the agreement is even as early as July 1st. It's a very controversial question. Whether or not the Trump administration would greenlight it, how it would greenlight it, what it means it would greenlight it are really big questions. I know here at the Post, we've been doing a lot of follow-up on that and talking to the Trump administration. They say, if it was done in the way that they wanted and as per their plan. But remember where we left it before coronavirus started was that their plan wasn't actually mapped out. We don't have the map. We don't really know what's being annexed. Certain parts were defined, certain parts weren't. And then coronavirus happened, and we stopped talking about it. And now it's slowly coming back into the headlines. I mean, there's other issues. Look at the northern border, and I'm sure Amos could talk to this much more than I could. And I'm not a military reporter. I just work with our military reporters, but you look at what's even like recently what's been going on in Syria and the number of altercations that have happened there. The holes being cut in the border fence. There is an altercation waiting to happen, an escalation waiting to happen, and we know that, but we haven't been able to focus on it. So come summer, if the bell curve is right of the 6 to 8 weeks, if the hot weather works and we're able to have sort of the scalpel effect and isolate just who needs to be, and the rest of society goes back to life, then we will start noticing those issues as well. Look, you have an American election coming up. You're there in November. That has tremendous impact actually on Israel. What Joe Biden is going to do versus if Trump gets in, and the bipartisan challenges that we're facing in terms of our relationship, that's going to need to come back sometime, in the fall. And I think that all of these things, if coronavirus gets under control, will be hot issues, but we've failed to discuss them appropriately as we normally would because of coronavirus up till now.
Mm-hmm. Nathan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering that before we hit this crisis, we were in a crisis already, and that crisis involved not having a government for so long. And the impact of that was that certain parts of society that you really need to be working well when you hit a health crisis have been really struggling. For example, the NGO sector. The NGO sector has been missing out on certain funds, certain licenses. So when this crisis hit, NGOs that you really need as a safety net were actually in a weakened state, and that's very concerning. I'll stop there because there's other things that will come to in the course of our discussion, I'm sure.
Awesome, amazing. I hope that this first 40 minutes has really opened up a lot of questions for all of those who are watching from their homes. As a reminder, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and we'll be unmuting people as we ask them to ask their questions. But before we do that, I want to turn it back over to our students who are going to kick us off with some questions of their own. Alyssa, I know you have something prepared. Do you want to unmute yourself and get us started with some community source questions?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so a question that I had was, as journalists in Israel who report to largely American audiences, how do you feel about your American counterparts reporting on Israeli news from the US? Can you give us insight on how the way of reporting about Israel is different in the United States than in Israel itself?
Whoever wants to kick it off, feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to answer. I worked in the United States as a journalist for a number of years in between, and I think that it's very different reporting on Israel from outside. You see Israel very differently when you live here, and you understand the nuances, I think, in a different way. Also, just in being close with some of the correspondents here who work for some of the papers abroad, what I would say is that there's like a quota, and there's a different amount of space given to Israel news in the United States, right? Because they're covering mostly U.S. news, whereas we're covering mostly Israel news. And so the kinds of stories, well, at least what I understand from them, that the Washington Post correspondent or the New York Times correspondent would file are very specific to fill the holes that those papers have. And so whereas I might be able to write 6 different stories, in a couple of days with different nuances and different sides and different perspectives, they get one chance. And so I think that you don't see or look at like Times Israel Haaretz, it's the same thing. So if you I think if that we have more of an opportunity, and that unfortunately the Americans reading American papers don't get to see all the different perspectives, and they get really one perspective based on which is the perspective of the publication that they're reading in the United States. I also think that just like for me, like if we want to cover Jewish community abroad, unless we're using one of our local correspondents or a Jewish Telegraphic Agency story, we aren't on the ground, so we understand the situation in New York differently than the community in New York. And so I always think it's really important to read news from where it's happening. And that's why, even though I can have, my team, let's say, write a story about what's going on with coronavirus in New York, I actually tried to get the JTA story written by the New York correspondent because I feel like that person knows the story better. And the same thing, what I would ask for people reading about Israel is they should read it from Israeli publications in English, because they'll get a better story.
Very quickly, Amos or Nathan, do you want to add? And then we're going to jump over to Michael.
Yeah, I would say that when you're reading about Israel from abroad, I think the Palestinian story will always be at the center. I think that's kind of perhaps one could say that when you're reading news in Israel, some people will say that the Palestinian issue is often absent disproportionately, whereas when you're reading it from abroad, that Palestinian issue is always very much at the center because that's the story that is told about Israel. And then there are certain technical things which just will skew one's view of Israel based on the way the reporting is done. Like when I meet groups here for lectures, they will often say to me, well, isn't it the case that pretty much all Israeli settlers are American immigrants? And I'll say, well, no, the American immigrants are a small minority, but why does that perception come? Because when the news crews go to interview settlers, they're obviously going to choose the settlers with the best English, and they're going to be the American immigrants. So we all have an impression that all settlers are American immigrants. So there's certain technical processes that go into making the news about Israel that just skew our views a little bit. So I'd just say, you know, the best way is always to be to handle the news consumption with a little bit of caution.
Mm. Trust and caution, the right balance, right? All right, Michael, we're going to turn it over to you.
Great. So my question has to do with the Arab and ultra-Orthodox population. So both the Arab and ultra-Orthodox populations have been highlighted throughout the corona crisis. And I'm wondering, from what you've seen, how has the crisis highlighted or changed the relationship between these populations and the government, the military, and the general Jewish population?
Okay, should I start? Okay, it's an excellent question. We've mentioned that in our opening remarks. Regarding the ultra-Orthodox, they were hit worse than anybody else. It had to do with certain aspects that both Maayan and myself have mentioned. It was the beginning, the crisis here in Israel started around Purim, where many Jews took part in youth celebrations. And especially the ultra-Orthodox communities, there were thousands who were together in all kinds of parties and so on. And apparently a lot of people got ill there. Later on, it had to do with the health minister, Litzman, who was a member of the ultra-Orthodox community, a Haredi politician. Many of his decisions actually worked against his community while trying to buy time and give them more space, if you'd like, for their religious worship and so on. The end result was that more people were hurt. Because of that, they became more needy. If you look at the list of towns that were hit badly by the virus, actually, I think 6 of the first 10 leading cities in Israel, when it comes to the percentage of people ill with the virus, are ultra-Orthodox, either completely or have ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods. So this means that they depended more on the country, on the state, and actually that they depended on more help from the military, from the Israeli army. And as you know, most ultra-Orthodox men do not serve in the army. So that was quite a change. And I think in the long run, it may help to improve the relationship between that community and the state and the army. I'm trying to avoid too much of a positive spin on events, but I think in the long run, it may have positive implications. Regarding the Arab community, on the one hand, and my colleagues have mentioned that already, many Arab Israelis are in the medical profession. And this gives them more points, if you'd like. They score more points with the general population because of that. On the other hand, in most Arab towns and villages, they were hurt, I think, less than the average Israeli town. We don't know exactly why this happens. It may have to do with genetics. If you look at Arab countries around the Middle East, most of them report low levels of illness with coronavirus. There, it may have to do with the health system or the fact that they don't have enough tests. But it's quite clear that apart from a few Arab towns, most Arab villages and towns were not hit too badly with the virus. So we'll have to see where this is leading in the long run. I think for the relationship between the Arab community and the state of Israel, I think things may improve because of the virus. And as Maayan has mentioned, even our relationship with the Palestinians, it won't solve the Palestinian conflict, but the fact that we've been quite effective at cooperating, both with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and even with Hamas in Gaza over fighting the virus together, I think in the long run, it may have some positive consequences for both of us.
Yeah, I'd actually like to comment on that though as well, because I mean, I agree with almost everything that Amos said. I would say that we actually don't know how hard hit the Arab Israeli towns are, and we're starting to see a change in those numbers. You look at Hura, Rahat, more the Bedouin communities, and you start to see that once they shifted testing, which they weren't doing enough in the Arab communities, over to the Bedouin and Arab Israeli communities, we started to see an increase in the number of patients. And so, you know, at one point there was 150, I think like end of last week, only in East Jerusalem that were infected with the virus, numerically, statistically, but they hadn't done enough tests. And on Tuesday, many of the Arab municipalities are actually planning to strike, saying that there wasn't enough done for the Arab Israeli communities, that there was many tests going on, that we have a capability of doing 15,000 tests per day. When people in the Jewish community weren't coming, we were just not taking these tests. We should have moved them over to the Bedouin community, the Arab Israeli communities. And when we did start to do it, we started to see an increase in the numbers. So I think you look at the different points up in the Triangle area, there were some Arab cities shut down. And I think that one of the things that, as much as the positive came out, and I think there was a ton of positive that came out from this, there's also some negative, which is there's a real discrepancy between how we handle the Arab Israeli community and how we handle the Jewish community. And it came out in, I think, two ways. One is education. We shut down the schools like 160 countries around the world. Okay, fine. We moved to distance learning. When we moved to distance learning, and I, as a parent, and I'm sure Nathan, you also, I heard you're a parent, and I'm sure Amos, you are too, suffering through this online learning has been an extreme struggle on my end. And I can tell you that when I have, thank God, enough computers and things for my children, in communities where they don't have enough, where they don't have smartphones, where there isn't access to Zoom, there's a big gap between, and that's not just in the Arab Israeli community, that's also in socioeconomic areas that are lower, but there is a certain and a very key gap over there. And it was brought up many times in our Knesset coronavirus committees, it was brought up in the Knesset plenary, and still, even though some kids, as I said, grades 1 through 3 went back to school today, in most municipalities by Tuesday, most of the rest, the Arab schools are not going back. They're not going back because they can't handle the restrictions that are being put on them by the health ministry, and there's not enough support from the government. So I think that has also come out. The other thing that, so it came out in education, and then it also came out again in the testing, because it took us too long to open up a mobile testing center, one of these drive-through testing centers from Magen David Adom in East Jerusalem. We did it, but it took us too long. And why did it take us so long? Why did we start? Now, of course, the Haredi areas had more. But the other thing you have to look at is that where the Arab community and the Haredi communities are the same, is they're living in very crowded environments with many family members in one home. And so I actually pulled these statistics. I don't know if I can find them right now, but a couple weeks ago, the health ministry put out a very striking study. And here I highlighted the numbers because I think it's important to think about this. In the Haredi community, we had in Bnei Brak, which Amos mentioned, there were only 350 families that had the virus, even though there were so many more people. And that's because there were sometimes as many as 5 people in one family who were infected with the virus. And we see the same thing in the Arab Israeli community because they live together. So in Tel Aviv, at the same day, there were 358 families infected, right? There were 358 people infected. Now, 353 families, many more people, 358 people, but in Tel Aviv, you live with 1 to 3 people in your home. So you don't, and because we know that the virus tends to spread more within a nuclear family, you know that that's what happened in Bnei Brak and in the Arab Israeli society. And so I think it's important to think about that sometimes, yes, they weren't following instructions, but sometimes it was just their living environment that didn't allow. And also the communication, again, that we talked about from the government was, again, a very big gap. We put out in Hebrew right away. The Haredi community isn't online. They're not looking at the health ministry website, so they didn't know about the restrictions. And the same thing when they didn't put it out in in Amharic for the Ethiopian community. They didn't put it out in English for the immigrant community. They didn't put it out quickly enough in Arabic necessarily. So if the communication isn't good, you can't expect people to follow restrictions. And so I think you always have to have that in mind when you think about, you know, the Haredi community and the Arab community, and that I don't think that we did a good job in the beginning with handling the Arab community. I think we're doing better now. But it wasn't that we don't have a huge rate in the Arab communities, that we did not test. And as we are testing, we are seeing a big spike in many of the communities, and again, especially in the Bedouin communities.
Thank you. Nathan, I'm going to put you on pause for one moment because I am noting the time and want to make sure we get to a few other voices in my community, but you're going to be first to answer for the next question. Is that all right?
Everything's
all right.
great.
Okay, sounds good. There's always a real struggle when you have brilliant minds together between breadth and depth. You want to get as many questions in so that we can touch as many topics. And also there's so much rich material to dig into that it's hard to know where to find that balance. But I'm going to turn us to our next question, which is from Rebecca Ayrton, who is the student president of Harvard Hillel. So Rebecca, I'm going to allow you to talk in a moment, and welcome, and please share your question. All right, go for it, Rebecca. Oh. Rebecca, can you hear us? All right.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, everyone for organizing, and I want to send my regards to Maayan from myself and from the rest of the Jerusalem Post intern crew. I'm wondering how the coronavirus pandemic has affected Israel's relationships with the rest of the world, and specifically what would happen if Israel were to create the vaccine. How would that impact its relations with other countries? I'm also wondering, sort of on a separate note, how being forced inside has affected journalistic practices, whether it's much harder to get information this way because you can't actually travel around, or if the move to virtual has been fairly smooth for journalists throughout Israel.
Nathan, kick us off.
Sure. I mean, as a journalist, for me, it's been bliss for journalism because, first of all, we are allowed to go out as journalists. We've not been restricted at any time. With a press card and a face mask, we can travel. And basically, the rest of the population is pretty bored. So everyone's picking up their phones all the time. So people that you would usually be looking for days upon end are actually picking up their phones. People are keen to be interviewed. People are keen to talk, and that aspect of it has been very good in terms of journalism. I think it's also led to a great interest in these topics, a great thirst for people to want to know what is actually going on. So that's been very positive. In terms of the research and the innovation that's going on in Israel and questions regarding how that would be met by the rest of the world, I think, you know, this has led to a set of realizations that that we're dependent upon this kind of innovation to find our way through it. And I think that you know, if Israel were to come up with a vaccine, I think there would be very few people who would refuse to take this because it is Israeli. I actually think that people who do like to wave the flag for Israel should be very careful talking about this, because I've heard people already starting to make all sorts of statements saying, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if Israel would come up with a vaccine, because then it would put people on the spot and force people into a corner and be this great kind of victory for Israel in terms of calling out BDS. I would very much caution against this. I think Israel should just carry on doing what Israel does best, and we should be very cautious about politicizing anything to do with this crisis. That will be my thought on that.
Cool. Amos, would you like to add anything?
No, I agree with Nathan totally.
Maayan?
I don't really have anything to add. I agree too. I just want to say hi back to you, Rebecca. It's so great to see your name pop up on the screen.
Amazing. I'm going to turn it over to Jonah Steinberg to read out for us a question that we received from a graduate student at the Harvard Kennedy School from Anastasia. Jonah, could you please share that question with us?
Yes, I just need to find it again. Anastasia was asking what, she says, these are unique times. Is there anything in the past that our panelists can compare to the current journalism environment today? It almost seems, and she says this with a smile, it almost seems like reporting, an ironic smile, I take it, it almost seems like reporting from a war zone.
Look, I think there are similarities. I'm a military correspondent. I've done this slight professional change because this is what my editors asked me to do once the crisis began. They said, look, a virus hitting, a pandemic hitting in such a way is quite similar to a war. A national crisis is like any other national crisis, and go ahead, start trying to analyze and cover it. So this is what I'm doing. There are some similarities with Israel's wars, and I've covered more than my share of those. I think because many of Israel's recent wars have had a lot to do with the home front. The people, the civilians were actually involved and were hurt by rocket fire and so on, and had to make changes in their lives and so on. But this is the end of the list of similarities. Other than that, I think it's bigger than anything we covered. This is on the international level. It's different than war with Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Second Intifada or anything like that. I can make comparisons. There were actually more Israelis, of course, killed in the Second Intifada. There were more horrific events than what we're experiencing, what we're going through right now. But having said that, this is different. Your president likes to say that we're fighting an invisible enemy. Well, this is true. It is invisible, and it's harder to grasp what's going on. It's been very, very different. Nobody has memories from 1918. I mean, we weren't here. We may have read about that sometime in high school, but that was a long time ago for all of us. So this is a very, very, very different challenge, and we're facing historic times. We'll see how we get through, but there are similarities with covering Israel's wars, but this is, again, I think that the scope of this thing, if you'd like, is much bigger than anything I've experienced. And I've been doing journalistic work for 25 years or so. So this is, I can compare. I think this is the most significant event I've been through.
Great, amazing. Maayan or Nathan, do you want to add?
I think one similarity to wars, not exactly in the way this is being lived, but something that we've not mentioned yet, which is really important, is tourism. And tourism is so important to Israel. It's so important for Israeli identity, the sense that Israelis, we live in a place that people want to visit. We live in this place that is not just our place, it's a place that connects us to the rest of the Jewish world, who we welcome in huge numbers, people like you guys who might otherwise be coming on Birthright, other people, we welcome you in huge numbers, especially in the summer, especially at Passover. It's a huge part of the Israeli identity, that pride that we're welcoming people in. That's gone. That's something that happened during war times. That's something that happened in 2014 to a lesser extent, but that is a similarity. And second of all, there's the economic consequences. Everybody I know in the tourism business, just like that, finding themselves at home without pay, and that's been absolutely, absolutely devastating. So I think that's a very key element of what's going on here.
And if I can ask something that's not directly related to war, but directly related to covering this and comparing it to past coverage, I actually think, just from being a journalist for a while, and I'm sure Amos and Nathan can think about this as well, think about SARS, swine flu, those are in our time. Mayor's, since we've been journalists, I don't know if covered health and whatever, but there have been many international crises or even national crises at different levels. But it seems that just like the internet has changed so much in the last 10 years, that also had a big impact on this virus. If you look at the numbers in Israel, as everyone sort of talked about, and the success, quote unquote, that we've had in terms of keeping the numbers down, this was not the crisis from a death perspective or a health perspective that we all expected it to be here in Israel. And actually in most of the world, there were, of course, China, there's places, right, in Italy, the United States. But if you look internationally, the death rate is not nearly as high as we assumed at the beginning that it was going to be. And what happened was that there was an international panic that was fed, I think, also by the social networks and the way that we communicate today and the ability for us to be global, even as we're not traveling. And I think that had a tremendous impact on the way that we cover the crisis. I mean, the comparators we made between countries, right? Like the way whether it's here in Israel on our nightly news or in our newspapers saying, here's what it looks like in Italy versus Switzerland versus the United States versus Israel, whatever, we start to see, it's very different than anything in that sense. And I think social networks had a lot to do with it.
The next question that we have coming in is touching a little bit on next steps, exit strategies, and what can be learned. And Maayan, you mentioned when we spoke last week that was something that is particularly on your mind right now. So we have Alexis Bolner, who is another undergraduate student in the Harvard Hillel community. Alexis, I'm gonna enable you to talk and unmute you now. You should be able to talk in a moment. And if you wanna share your question.
Okay, you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. I just want to thank you guys again for being here with us. And I'm wondering, do you think there's anything the US can learn from Israel as we decide how to move forward with handling the coronavirus?
Are you thinking especially in terms of exit strategy? Because I'm not sure we have an actual strategy to learn from. So which is my biggest concern with exit strategy. Look, I think that what the world can learn from Israel, and I think each country has something from which we can learn, right? But from Israel, I think that we handled, again, our lockdown very well. We did a very good job of maintaining discipline, and sort of also in that sense, we communicated very clearly during the lockdown. During each stage, there were briefings, and we did a good job. I think that when it comes to what the United States can learn going forward is yet to be seen, because we just started our quote unquote exit strategy. We're still seeing good numbers. That's wonderful, but we don't really know why. We don't know if it's the restrictions and now we're going to see a big upswing. We don't know if there's a 68-week bell curve on this virus and it was going to die down anyway, like we're seeing in a lot of parts of the world. And we don't know if the warm summer weather that we're getting now here in Israel, you can see how I'm dressed, it's beautiful even in Jerusalem. We don't know if that's contributing. And we don't know what the second wave, if it's coming, and what it's going to look like. So I think right now we still need to tread cautiously and monitor. And in another, let's say, month or two, we should check back in, and hopefully we'll have a lot of great lessons for the world to learn from Israel in terms of how to exit the coronavirus lockdown and successfully.
Awesome. I see that we're getting somewhat close to time, and so I'm going to begin to wrap us up. One of the things that a good friend and mentor of mine once said about talking about Israel is that it is an art of changing the wheels while driving the bus in many ways. And Maayan, I think that's a little bit of what you just alluded to. As we close out, I'm curious if the three of you, maybe we'll start with Nathan, then go to Amos, and then Maayan. What are some of the big questions that those of us who are living here in the States and elsewhere and are deeply invested in Israeli society, what are some of the big questions that we should be looking out for when it comes to Israeli society right now as we're transitioning out of the peak of Corona and into whatever comes next?
I think that there's various movements that have gone on in Israeli society during this time, which are going to be absolutely key to following over the coming months. I think that we're going to see some very interesting development in terms of gender dynamics, some of them positive, some of them negative. I mean, this has been a very trying time for some families. We've seen, unfortunately, a rise in domestic violence, only part of which will have been reported. People closed in their houses. Some aspects of Israeli society have been negative trends in that respect. But I think also every crisis brings with it a shift in gender dynamics. And I think in certain communities that have really, people have been pushed to the edge, with people working, people trying to work, people trying to take care of children. We'll actually see a shift with more more faith in the ability of women in places where that's been limited. So we're going to see some interesting gender shifts. The point that we've kept returning to in terms of Jewish and Arab, I think that's going to be really important. And people are starting to say this video campaign that I mentioned before was basically saying to people, hey, you know, everyone's happy to put their lives in the hands of Jewish nurses and doctors. Let's talk about how we run the country. Why is it a taboo to have an Arab party in government? You know, asking those big questions about the way Jewish people interact with Arab people. I think we're going to see that. And I think the issue to do with the ultra-Orthodox community that we mentioned just before, I think that's going to be a challenge, because I think we're going to be working through for many months with different people having different attitudes. Was it the conduct of the community? Was it the circumstances of the community? People are always going to look for someone to blame, and there are a lot of people in society who are pointing fingers at the ultra-Orthodox community. Is it practices? Is it the way people have behaved? Or is it, you know, that people are looking for someone to blame and it's a set of circumstances? And I think there has been a bit of a rupture there. And we'll see if the good leadership of people like President Rivlin can help to fix that, as well as other things.
Thank you.
Perhaps two brief follow-up points to what Nathan has said. One is the financial aspect of the crisis. We still don't know how long it will take us to recover, how long it will take the world economy, but this is going to be devastating. You've mentioned tourism. The same goes for, of course, for flights anywhere in the world. And we'll have to see how this affects Israel. Some economists have said that there's a possibility, a worst case scenario in which we face a sort of a lost decade. In Israel's history, there was a lost decade for the Israeli economy after the Yom Kippur War of 1973. I hope it doesn't get that bad, but we're seeing high level of unemployment. More than 1 million Israelis are out of work. We haven't seen that for ages, for decades. So this is going to be quite something to deal with. Another issue which is connected almost directly is Netanyahu's fate, political fate. The way I see it right now, probably the prime minister would remain in power even during his trial. But considering the fact that so many Israelis are going to be frustrated with their economic situation, which was one of the strong points of his rule here, I think that there will be implications for the Israeli society, and some of this might even spill over to their attitude towards Netanyahu. It doesn't mean that we'll see the end of the Netanyahu era. We've heard those promises for many, many years, and he's managed to come out of almost any crisis. But this is going to be a big deal, I think. The implications of the financial situation, the consequences for his political career, and the stability of the government in the long run.
Great. I'll just piggyback on that, with regards to the government. I think that, today started the trial at the High Court as to whether or not we're going to allow Netanyahu to go ahead and form a government, if he can move forward with his plans for this unity government, yet to be seen. Likely it will happen is the take, but the question will also be the stability of this unity government with their large number of ministers and the impact that has when people are, as Amos said, going through an economic crisis, and then who will fall into the new roles. There's been a real shift in terms of priorities in the country, and I think we're going to see that play out in the next government. I think the biggest one was when Gabi Ashkenazi was fighting for the health ministry. Nobody ever asked for the health ministry before. It was like a joke. That's why Litzman had it for so long. And now people want it. So our priorities are shifting, and I think we're going to see that with who gets what. Also, we've had a very right defense ministership. Bennett is the most recent from the right-wing party, and that's now different. We have Gantz in that role. Let's see what happens. Those things will have impact on the way that we play out on the international and the national level. I think the other thing is that we will see a shift in how we deal with the medical system in general. I think that's going to be invested in and changed, and that there's a real opportunity there. And the last things are both societal and also international, is digital literacy has changed. This coronavirus has changed the world and has changed Israel too. It's changed our older population, it's changed the way we do business. And I think we're going to see that really impacting many things going forward in Israel and abroad. And the other thing is that, again, the American election is coming up. And I don't think we can not think about that in terms of what happens after Corona. And I think with Biden, we know certain things that will be the same. He's already said, I'll leave the embassy. He's already, we assume that's more or less, some of the American peace plan, if it moves forward, would move forward. But there's a real question on Iran and how we'll deal with Iran, which is going to start coming back to the forefront when this goes away. And I think that'll be something that we really need to watch for also. Yeah, that's it, I think.
Amazing. Thank you so much to the three of you. It sounds like what all of you have been saying is that as we transition out of the peak of Corona, some things that us who are not living in Israel can be looking for are some of the tensions and frictions in society that are really going to bubble up to the surface, maybe in exaggerated and new ways. So this is an especially important time to be following the news and see what comes out. So I hope all of you who are watching will join me in paying extra close attention to Israeli news in the coming weeks. Thank you so much, Amos, Maayan, and Nathan, for joining us. It is the greatest pleasure to be able to put a face to names that I have read and articles that you've written for so many years. It really has been such a great honor. Thank you for joining us. I noticed that Michael has tuned in as a guest and a listener today, and so I just want to give him one more shout out. Michael, you did such a beautiful and phenomenal job putting together this panel. Thank you so much for all of the work that you put into to make sure that this could happen, and Mazal Tov to you and Naomi and your family. And thank you so much, Michael and Alyssa, for jumping in and for doing our introductions and framing us and beginning our questions. Thank you to everyone who is out there watching. It was really such a pleasure to play with you all. It is really something special to be able to dig deep into intellectual, inspiring, and challenging conversations amidst all of the uncertainty going on in the world. So my most heartfelt thank yous to everyone who put this together, Michael, especially you, and to Harvard Hillel. I will turn it over to Jonah for a few final announcements, but again, just my most unending gratitude, Nathan, Maayan, and Amos, for joining us today. It was such fun to get to play together, and I hope that this is not the last time.
Great. Lauren has said the thank yous so warmly. All I can do is echo those to Nathan and Maayan and Amos, and also to Michael and Alyssa. Lauren, thank you so very much, and very special Mazel Tov to Michael and Naomi and Ezra. And Michael, thanks for tuning in from home. Just to remind you that this evening, this Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. will be Provost Alan Garber, who, as well as being provost of Harvard, is a medical doctor, and as well as being those two things, is also an economist, and his field is public health. So do tune in for that conversation and the one coming up on the 18th of May with Harvard's president, Larry Bacow, and stay tuned to your email for other online events between now and then. Again, to all of you, thank you so much. Thank you for letting Harvard Hillel into your homes in this time, and in so doing, being part of our community.
All right, Shavua Tov to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. To those in Israel, good night. To those in California, good afternoon. And to those in the East Coast, good evening. We'll see you all on Tuesday.